Okay, so I'm going to be providing an overview
اه
of Islam in the United States this evening, and I'll go through the different stages that are
estamos
represented in the
biraz
history of Muslims in the United States, and we'll have time also for questions and answers. This is going to be kind of highlights of major developments given the short amount of time. Of course, it's an important topic, and one can take an entire semester to study the details of different aspects of Islam in America, including, many important cultural dimensions, the influence of Muslims scientifically, technologically, economically, culturally, is significant. Maybe those issues can be addressed in a future presentation. The arts and culture is an important thing, and we'll touch upon it here. Significant developments in the timeline of Islam in America. So with that, we'll go to our first slide. Hopefully you can see that shift to the next slide. And I'll introduce the names of several figures for those of you who are following along. You can do further research on some of these individuals who I will be mentioning throughout the session. There will be quite a number of people that will be mentioned. So Pedro Alonso Niño, he's a Spaniard who is said to have been part of the voyages of Columbus in 1492. As many of us know, Columbus was given permission or support from the king and queen of Spain at that time to India, so that they could circumvent the Ottoman Empire and circumvent, other Muslim states that were intermediaries in the trade of the Mediterranean world and the Indian Ocean. The Europeans were starting to look for ways to have direct access to some of the raw materials and spices in particular in the East. So that crew that Columbus had, it said, was mixed. Of course, there were Spaniards and Portuguese and others in the crew, but it's very likely there were Muslims, people who were known as Moors, who would have been part of the crew as well, because Muslims at that time were among those who had exceptional knowledge of astronomy and navigation and cartography. So it would be natural for them to recruit such individuals to help them navigate. So this is just one of those figures. Columbus didn't actually reach what we call North America or the United States or America. He reached the Caribbean areas and Cuba uh, in that part. So he was close, but he didn't quite reach the what we consider the North American mainland in the 1490s. Um, but there were others who came in his footsteps, right? So there were other Spanish conquistadors, as they're called, who came, and they did reach Florida and Georgia and other places, and some of them went further into the Caribbean and reached Mexico, and others reached South America. So once it was known that there were significant lands in the Western Hemisphere, there were many expeditions to get a claim on these lands in the name of those, kings, even though there were obviously indigenous people living in those lands, but they conquered those people quite brutally. So in the part of the exploration of the American Southwest, there were also people who were part of those expeditions who are believed to have Islamic identity. They would be referred to as Moors, like Estevanico, who was originally from Morocco, but joined an expedition of another individual named Captain Narvaez. And they traveled along the Southwest, and ultimately, he died in those expeditions. But his name is in the records, the historical material. So We know that he wasn't a Spaniard, that he was a Moroccan. Therefore, so just in terms of identifying the presence of Muslims in the Americas, we can list Estevanico as one of those individuals. This is even, of course, before the formation of the state or the nation of the United States. And we know that as the Europeans started taking control of the west coast of Africa, and they were taking resources from the Americas, they needed to utilize labor in order to develop the crops and grow, different materials, cotton or tobacco and other things. And so they enslaved millions of Africans, and we know that that's an important aspect of American history that we still reconcile with today as Americans. And the African American people who live today, of course, their ancestors were among those who were enslaved. Now, amongst those millions, there were a certain percentage that were definitely Muslim, because we know that in West Africa, in Senegal, in the Gambia, in Mali, in Ghana, and other places, some of the tribes were Muslim. There were also tribes that were, they had their own indigenous religions, but Islam had spread in West Africa by this time of the early 1500s, through Morocco, through the Sahara, and, and Mansa Musa and other figures that we know from history, they had brought Islam to those regions, and it began to flourish in places like Timbuktu and other cities, and sometimes uh, there would be conflicts between the different tribes, uh, and that contributed, unfortunately, to their transport to the Americas. So there's a lot of records, historical records about um, the different tribes and the origins, the locations, the villages from which these different slaves had been acquired. And that's, a rich field that can be explored further. But generally, historians say that probably about 20% of those individuals who were enslaved were Muslim origin. There's different debates. Some people like to make the percentage higher, like 30% or even 40%, but it's hard to be sure and to justify those higher numbers. But I think 20% is a reasonable estimate. So that's all happening before really the United States comes into being, 1600s, in the time of the colonial, the American colonies that were part of the British Empire. England itself went through a process where some of the Christian leaders were arguing for the end of slavery, and then some of the American philosophers and church leaders also became abolitionists. Others, of course, wanted to maintain the institution of slavery, and those were mainly the southern states where the economy was built on plantation slavery. So they, of course, objected to ending the practice. But from a moral, philosophical standpoint, these European thinkers and Muslim thinkers, by the way, in the Ottoman world, were also arguing against enslavement of people, even though, within the Middle Ages in the Sharia, it was regulated in certain kinds of ways, but it was permitted in certain ways. But even hundreds, Muslim thinkers of that time period were also rethinking, that concept. Um, and it's in this time when Morocco has become a little more independent from the Portuguese and the Spaniards. There's a lot of conflict, of course, in that region, but Morocco has a sultan, and they decide to recognize the United States when the founding fathers, as they're called, declared independence from England. They were in a precarious situation. They needed to make sure they had enough allies so that they could withstand any attacks from England. And France was an ally for the independence movements. And Morocco signaled its willingness to support American independence as well. And they just hosted and received, and they established that relationship that continues to the present day. I think that's worth noting that a Muslim country was instrumental, sort of, in recognizing the independence of the United States. And we see that, even throughout this time, leading up to the Civil War, in the late 1800s, there's still slavery in the southern states. So even though America was established, or the United States was established within those colonies, and different territories further west were being purchased, right, or taken, right, taken from indigenous tribes, or purchased from France, for example, the Louisiana Purchase, um, which is what imperial powers were doing, because they, didn't consider the rights of the native people. They just negotiated according to their own beliefs about ownership of these lands that made up North America. But in this time, slavery is continuing, and there are a number of more notable Muslim figures who emerge in this time period. So they're not just the, you know, routine individuals who we know had Islamic origin and worked in the plantations and farms. There were some intellectuals. There were some people who had royal lineage, like Abdul Rahman ibn Ibrahim ibn Sori was a prince from West Africa. So he was highly educated. He was able to eventually function within the elite circles of the early American nation. Even though he had been enslaved, he was eventually manumitted, and he was able to operate within, the polite society that had emerged, in the nation's capital and other places. Similarly, Yarrow Mahmut had been enslaved. He lived a long time, and he ended up living in Georgetown, and became a well-known figure, and was actually, a portrait of him was painted by a famous American artist at that time. And Omar ibn Said is another one of these scholarly figures from Senegal, whose photo is at the bottom there. So these are just, evidences of how people of Muslim background, not only working class individuals, but people with educational background and, some capacity, they were able to become free individuals, and then contribute to defining the early pluralism within America, right? It is a predominantly Christian country, but there's a place for Muslims within the constitutional philosophy that was articulated in the founding, not full equality for people, because of course slavery continued, but just on the philosophical level, the founding fathers theoretically imagined that a Jewish person or a Moor could be the president of the United States. That's also kind of fascinating, just to think about the sort of philosophical underpinnings. It doesn't mean that it translated into real action, because of the nature of white supremacy and Christian supremacy in the United States that has played out. But in a theoretical sense, what is possible is still possible. All right, let's move on. Yet another example, another person named Bilali Muhammad, who was living in an area of Georgia called Sapelo Island. He was a scholar, an imam, and he made copies of some Islamic texts, like this one, the Risala, which was an important compendium of Maliki law in West Africa that he had studied in his youth, and he made more copies as he was living in the United States. So the US is starting to become more globally connected in the early 19th century. There are examples of those connections, like when the Sultan of Oman sent a ship, a large sailing ship, to New York, and it reached the port of New York, and it was, fascinating and ship coming into the to the dock, into the harbor, and just kind of having a broader perspective on the world because of these delegations that are starting to come, and the trade relations that the United States is building with various countries. The U.S. is still expanding its territorial control westward. It's not until, the 1850s when the state of California and other states become part of the Union, right? So between 1780s until the 1850s, there's steady expansion of what is considered the United States territory westward, step by step. The government is acquiring more territory or converting territories where people had moved but weren't part of the Union, when there were enough people part of the Union. And the US government had to manage those territories. That's the Wild West, so to speak, right? It's the age of cowboys and Indians, right? And so they hired somebody named Haji Ali, who was brought to Arizona, and the U.S. government thought maybe they could patrol the region not on horseback but on camels, because they thought, well, it's a desert environment, maybe camels would be better, and so they came up with the idea of importing a bunch of camels, and they brought Haji Ali as somebody who could manage them and take care of them and manage this patrol. But it didn't survive. It was just an experiment that they thought might work. But he's buried in Arizona. This figure, they would call him Hajj Ali because they couldn't really understand what is Hajj. Hajj was somebody who had performed the Hajj before, so he must have been known as Hajj Ali. Um, he's a very interesting figure in that regard. So again, one of those milestones in the history of Islam in America. Something to say, Subhanallah, because when the Civil War was taking place and the forces from the north had come into the state of Alabama, they were, decimating all of the infrastructure there, in the southern states. It's unfortunate that they were destroying buildings and things, and not just, trying to win certain battles, but they were causing damage, and they were going to destroy a library. And the custodian of the library there decided that, he needed to try to save some books. He was only able to retrieve one book before they destroyed the library, and that was the Quran that they had as a copy in the library. Because again, this kind of hostility towards Islam that we have seen in later decades, and sometimes we call it Islamophobia, a lot of that has to do with, the Cold War and the conflict with Iran and all of the things that happened, in terms of American foreign policy in the Middle East and the reaction to that, and terrorism and things like that. So in more recent decades, Americans and the media and the mindset has seen Islam in a certain light, as an enemy or as a threat. In the times that we're talking about right now, the 1800s, 1700s, not in the same way. I mean, of course, in the Middle Ages, there were the Crusades, there was the Reconquista, there was the conflict between the Ottoman Empire and different European empires, but those were empires. They were not nation states. They were not, it was not quite the same, because people were still engaging one another in trade across these different lands. They didn't have such fixed ideas about us versus them. They might have had an idea about being a Christian or being a Jew or being a Muslim, but we know that in the Middle Ages, all of these people of different religions in the Mediterranean world were always interacting with one another, and they looked and spoke the same language. They looked similar. They had the same customs. They were shared customs. So their religious identities were different, but their customs were shared. So it was a different environment than what we would see today. And in this sort of intermediate period between the Middle Ages and the modern period, what we call the early modern period, 1700s, 1800s, people's ideas are not so fixed. And there might be curiosity, there might be some sense of mystery about what is Islam or who are Muslims, and more of an ethnic understanding rather than a religious understanding. But the intellectuals in European circles, of course, they had been drinking from the fountain of Islamic knowledge and thought for centuries. So the very well educated appreciated Arabic, they appreciated the knowledge, and the Quran was a representation of that civilization and culture. So it was included in the what would be a library. What would make a library would have to include the classics, including samples of the Quran. Interestingly, there were also some cases of intermarriage between Muslims and the native populations of different tribes in the United States. Sometimes the Muslims who came as slaves or in other ways, they didn't fit well within, white society, let's say, but they felt more at home within the Native American tribes, the culture, the communal sentiments, the simple living connected to the land. So some people connected with those communities and intermarried there. And there's a group that emerged called the Melungeons. There's different theories about what the word means, Melungeon. Maybe it's a version of the French word mélange, which is mixture. That's probably where the word comes from. But there's always, people proposing different origins for the word, um, like a Turkish origin, for example, um, or some African word. But I think it's important to know about this group in general, because you may encounter this term in the future in some conversation and you will be able to place it like, oh, okay, this represents the intermarriage of some Muslims with indigenous Americans in that time period of the 1800s. And some people living today would say that they are descendants of the Melungeons. And then we get into a phase what we consider to be like the initial wave of um, significant immigration or you would say voluntary immigration rather than the involuntary immigration of enslavement. Right? This is people who find a way or are permitted to, by ship, arrive on the shores of the United States. Right? So there are people from the Ottoman Empire. It's maybe 20,000 people in this time frame from different regions. The empire was large, of course. It controlled many parts of what we call the Middle East today, or the Arab countries. So people were coming from Turkey, from Syria, from Lebanon, some from Egypt, North Africa, some from Yemen, just, different folks. And sometimes they're individual men who are trying to make their way to the US for better opportunity, right? And that kind of story continues, I mean, throughout the 20th century. But America is a rising power. It's a huge place of opportunity in that sense, just because it's an um, untouched or untilled land for them. Who would go to North Dakota? Like if you were to ask any of us, we would not think of going to North Dakota perhaps as our first choice, like if we were just coming to the US. I'm not saying anything's wrong with North Dakota, but just as where would you find opportunity? You would think maybe Chicago or New York City or some other place. But the people who had arrived, some of the folks who had arrived in Chicago, they had an opportunity to move out to these uninhabited areas, such as Ross, North Dakota, because the US government was giving incentives. The Homestead Act, it's called, was giving incentives to different people, whoever wanted to make a house out in the plains and to become farmers and to develop those places so that small towns would develop, and eventually they would grow and there would be more commerce and there would be more connection by railroad or by roads to these different places. So it was an intentional settlement process, and some Muslims became part of that process because they felt maybe they had more freedom, they could practice their faith, they may didn't want to live in a dirty city or a bustling city. There are maybe different factors that motivated people, but the opportunity to make your own way, I think, could have also been appealing. So in addition to those people, there were people who came from Central Asia as well, like the Tatars from Russia. There's a photograph here at the bottom, is a Tatar community in New York City in the late 1800s, just as an example. One of the famous figures who was probably the first white convert, or at least notable one, to Islam is a man named Alexander Russell Webb. Perhaps you've heard of him. He's often cited in different treatments of Islam in America. And he was an editor, a journalist. He was a diplomat, and he was exposed to Islam, and then he converted. And in this time, again, there's not like a clear distinction between different kind of madhahib of Islam. It's just like the broader concepts of Islam: submission to one God, not a Christian formation of Islam, of religion, belief in the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and just sort of the Eastern lifestyle and mindset, which for some time was starting to become an industrialized country, right? The Industrial Revolution had been underway. People are getting more detached from nature. Christianity has some, kind of strictures, and some people feel alienated. And so they look for other um, worldviews or outlooks. Some people gravitate to Buddhism or some other Eastern religions, and then some people discover Islam. And in this time, Alexander Russell Webb was one of those who felt at home in the Islamic tradition. He had traveled to other parts of the world that also helped. Going to Egypt and Turkey, for example, as a diplomat, exposed him to the lifestyle of Muslims and their commitment to their faith and their daily converted. He advocated for Islam. It's one of the first sort of media presentations of Islamic ideas to the broader public. There was an important World's Fair that took place in 1893 in Chicago, and he prepared for that. He wrote articles and he spoke at the fair as the representative of Islam. And then he started a journal thereafter. So he was dedicated to the idea of propagating an intellectual understanding of Islam in that time frame. He was even acknowledged by the Turkish consul in New York for his efforts, which I think is, quite meaningful. So he and intellect starting to make it not just as a cultural phenomenon amongst a small group of immigrants, but something that can be understood by the intelligentsia of America, the people who read the New York Times and so forth, or who work in universities. And there are different communities that are continuing to arrive in the United States, whether they're from Albania or from other parts of the Ottoman world, from Lebanon, from South Asia, and each of these communities starts to build their own mosque community, right? Whether it's the Lebanese in Cedar Rapids, sometimes this mosque that they built in 1935 is called the Mother Mosque. It had been standing until recently. I think it still exists, but it suffered some flood damage some years ago. But the the mosque building still survives, so it's still identified as the Mother Mosque. But even before that, there was another mosque in North Dakota that doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately. But a new documentary on American Muslims has just been released on PBS, and one of the episodes talks about the community that started the mosque in North Dakota, and it's an excellent series that I encourage everyone to look up and watch those episodes. They cover many different groups within American Islam and how they came about. This is a photo of that Mother Mosque, as it's called. And then a missionary activity, starts, especially amongst the group called the Ahmadiyya in that time in the late 1800s in Pakistan or the Indian subcontinent at the time. There was a scholar or preacher who became very popular. Them ended up coming to the West or to the United States, and they were preaching their understanding of Islam. In their understanding, they saw Mirza Ghulam as kind of a prophetic figure. Of course, for other Muslims, that was seen as a blasphemous statement or position to take. And there's, ongoing debate to the present day about the Ahmadiyya form of Islam. I'm not, getting into that, whether it's, orthodox or not orthodox or anything like that. I mean, we can all evaluate that. But just as a historical phenomenon, we have to acknowledge or recognize that members of the Ahmadiyya community were involved in propagating Islam, broadly speaking, in this time frame of the early 1900s. In the 1920s, there were Sunni Muslim groups existing as well, because some of those immigrant groups, of course, they came from places where Sunni Islam predominated, and some Shia Muslims were also present, right? Because within the broader demographics of Muslims, from different parts of the world, certain proportion are Shia. And so they would also be part of that immigration story. But they weren't necessarily proselytizing so much. They were concerned about their own communities and making sure they could pass on their faith to their children as they were raising them in this environment, but they weren't so much fixated on attracting a lot of other people, quote, Americans, to Islam. But the Ahmadis were. They were missionary by nature. They wanted to spread their version so that they could convince more people to join them and gain strength, because they were a minority within a motivated to do that. Eventually, they had an impact in some ways. I mean, they did reach a lot of African Americans and convert them to their form of Islam. Later on, African Americans were also exposed to what we might call mainstream Islam through other channels. And so African American Sunni Muslims grew, but there were also Muslims who were part of this Ahmadiyya convert group. And we'll talk about that in a moment a little bit more. I also want to touch upon the fact that apart from these sort of normative traditions, we don't see Salafi Islam in this time frame, right? Because that's something that emerges in the 20th century in a way. So that doesn't happen until the mid 20th century. But we have normative Islam, which includes Sufism, for a long period of historical time. Within that form of Islam, the Sufi kind of orientation, there were some people who came from India and South Asia. There were people who came from Africa, and they were also influential and charismatic people. So they started attracting some converts. Inayat Khan is one of them. Sheikh Dawood is another. And I just want to make mention of the fact that, Sufism is also kind of within the mix of what's emerging as an American Islam, which is not really developed yet in this time frame, but these are the basic building blocks that will eventually um, continue to grow or have influence or merge with other trends that take place. Okay, so then we get to the African American Islamic development, right? We have this out of the experience of slavery, African Americans generally, mostly Christian, because if they had been Muslim as slaves, they had been converted to Christianity. And those who had never had been Muslim, they had been converted to Christianity anyways, from other uh, orientations in Africa. So they were part of the Black church, right? But many African Americans felt like this was an imposed religion. It wasn't their true identity. So they started to search for connections back to their ancestral religion. For some of them, that meant connecting back to Islam. In some cases, they didn't connect directly back to Maliki Islam, which was practiced in West Africa, but they liked the idea of a different religious identity that was Moorish. They would call it Moorish as a way to differentiate it from, or differentiate their identity from American or from white society, right? Or from the slave identity. They wanted to find a way to have a break from their slave experience. And so they could call back to their Moorish ancestry. One of the important figures in this this process, was Noble Drew Ali, or Timothy Drew, as he was known as he grew up. And he, kind of synthesized a certain a mindset or philosophy of this Moorish identity. And of course, he had been raised, and with exposure to the Bible and Christianity, and also knew that there was Islam and the Quran, and he was kind of coming up with his own synthesis, mostly as an identity, not as a religion per se, but as a organization under which African Americans could distinguish themselves from the mainstream as it was at that time, where blacks were, still subjugated, right? Because even after after the Civil War and the quote emancipation, there were still second class policies in place for African Americans. They could not, they're called the Jim Crow laws. They could not share the same uh, vehicles. They could not go to certain restaurants. They had to drink from separate water fountains. All of these things were in place. So this was a mechanism by which to overcome those limitations. I'd say that they don't really apply to us because we have dignity through our own ancestral identity, and we're going to assert that, right? So he came up with a kind of organization called the Moorish Science Temple. Science meaning, it's, rational. There's some meaning and weight to this. It's not just fantasy, and it's Moorish. That's our true identity. And it's a temple because we have to have some kind of religious exemptions, so to speak. Like, we can operate in this capacity because we're a religious group, so you can't really shut us down according to the Constitution, right? The First Amendment. These are the kind of things that are going into why it's called Moorish Science Temple. Ancestry in Africa, or to Mauritania, or to the Moorish origins. And they would pick up Arabic words, right? Or Ottoman terms like bey, right? They would use these titles again to sort of distinguish themselves from the typical Black African American. And they grew. They grew in their membership over the decade of the 1920s and 30s, and started to gain some notoriety because they were more willing to be self-sufficient or challenge some of the norms that Christian African Americans, they kind of accepted the sort of subservient status within white society. and this was a way to break out of that. And there were other thinkers and other people like Marcus Garvey and W. E. Du Bois who were intellectual and they wanted to bring the African American community to a new level of strength and self-identity. And this led to the emergence of the Nation of Islam. I know our time is running short, so I'm going to try to conclude in about 5 minutes. But hopefully this has been helpful just in terms of kind of a progression of development. And Wallace Fard Muhammad is somebody who is said to have been influential on Elijah Muhammad, who then became a prophet of God within the Nation of Islam. And sometimes he would even be, elevated to the status of a kind of Mahdi or reformist figure. So the Nation of Islam was a black nationalist movement, essentially, to, again, enable African Americans to create a society that was not so dependent upon the mainstream society and that could be self-sufficient in their economic practices, in their identity, in their religion, and in opposition to the mainstream society. At the time, Malcolm X was the most prominent of their spokespersons. I think we all know of Malcolm X. He was assassinated in 1965, even though at that time he was starting to move himself and some of his followers into what we would consider to be, mainstream Sunni Islam after he had performed the pilgrimage and, visited Muslim countries. Elijah Muhammad's son, Warith Din, ultimately took control of the NOI when Elijah passed away in 1975. And he also, like Malcolm, had been exposed to Sunni Islam, let's say, and he was trying to get the community to move. And most of the followers of the nation did transition in the 70s into what we would consider mainstream Islam. And that is the basis of the majority of the African American Muslims today are people who came out of the nation, who maybe had been part of the nation, and then their children and grandchildren just grew up as Sunni Muslims and continued, converted many of the temples of the nation into the mosques that we find sometimes in the inner cities of Chicago or Los Angeles or Boston or, other cities where the nation had previously flourished. We also know of Muhammad Ali, who was a member of the Nation of Islam for a long period of time and is notable because he refused to go and fight in Vietnam and was imprisoned for that, and then, ultimately was victorious in terms of his, what he stood for and the principles that he stood for, and he was recognized, ultimately with the Presidential Medal of Freedom, but he, suffered a lot professionally and personally because of that decision at the time to stick with Elijah Muhammad. He had been friends with Malcolm. They had some, falling out a little bit because Malcolm, was shut down by Elijah Muhammad, and Muhammad Ali, stuck with Elijah in that time frame. And later on, of course, he also followed Warith Din into mainstream Islam. Okay, we're coming to the end here. So in the late 50s, we find, now these Muslim immigrant communities are becoming more and more established. There are embassies in Washington, D.C., and they help establish the Islamic Center of Washington. The U.S. government is trying to engage Muslim countries to make sure that it stays on their side and not on the side of the Soviets. And, there's a lot of complex geopolitics that, we're not going to get into here, but it's just, connected to the fact that this Islamic Center in DC kind of became, a pride and joy of American Islamic relations in that time frame. In 1960, there were probably around 200 or 230 mosques, and today we have almost 3,000 mosques. So you can see it's, a significant increase in about 80 years. The MSA was established in the early 1960s, which later on became the Islamic Society of North America. That's a photograph of students who eventually settled in the United States and organized mosques, and they decided to create this umbrella organization called ISNA, but it came out of a university setting initially. And since the 1990s, we've seen the growth of numerous Muslim organizations to cover many different areas of interest. I won't list them all, but if you just anybody who's involved in Islamic work today will know, the origin of many of these active organizations today comes from the early 1990s and since then. And much of this was possible because of the Immigration Act of 1965, which opened up further immigration, removed quotas, which were limits on how many people could immigrate from different countries. And so Muslims from many, many different parts of the world came, and really, at this point, their children and grandchildren, maybe third or fourth generation of Muslims, along with the African American Muslims, form the American Muslim community. And the integration of Muslims and Islamic culture into American culture is really in these last 70, 80 years, since 1965. And that's a constant challenge because the growing presence of Muslims also invited hostility towards Muslims, even if it was misplaced and misunderstood because of political interests or certain interest groups who want to create misunderstanding about Muslims, or whether it's Christian nationalism and some people who think that America is only a Christian nation, and so therefore Islam is a problem. Like, we see this playing out in many, many different parts of the country, and we have to constantly rise up to that challenge and work to overcome those challenges and to educate people and to help people understand that the Muslim community is extremely diverse. We have people and their families who've been here for many generations, and we still have brand new people who are coming every day to the United States from all over the world, including Muslims, and they're here to contribute to the society and to improve their lives and their
Senin
families
annen diyor.
and
Hı?
so on and so forth.
Kimden diyor
So
yanlış yapmış.
these are the kind of conditions that we find ourselves in today. And we have, opportunity to continue to work. We have more coordination, I would say, amongst American Muslims to advance our interests and to have representation in the media, in the political arena, as this slide is showing. We've seen some progression, and we have a lot of Muslims in different positions, not necessarily in Congress, although we have some there, but just locally, we've seen so many Muslims enter into politics. And that's only one aspect of how we can have an influence and how we can support one another as a broad Muslim community. We support our immediate communities, but we can also connect on a broader basis to have a united front on different issues that matter to us, whether it's how Islam is presented in the schools and curriculum, or whether it's some things about like gender and how it's managed in the society and the definitions about that, or if it's political issues like Palestine or justice issues. We can work together as a broad Muslim community to, address our interests. And you can see that, today, half of American Muslims are people who were born in the United States, even though their ancestry is, of course, from many different young in that sense. We have a lot of Muslims who are on the younger side. So we have to be thinking about what is life going to be like for them in the coming decades, and how can we ensure that we protect our communities and we continue to contribute to improving the society, because there are a lot of areas that need effort and improvement, and we have something to offer from our faith and from our cultural identities. So I'll stop there and hope that was helpful, and happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, thank you very much there, sir. So we have few questions in the chat, and after then we can start kind of in-person questions. First one is a simple one. Is there any way that we can have the slides? I mean, can you share the slide or is it fine for you?
Yeah, yeah, I can send you the slides. I can send you or whomever I should send them to, I can send and you can distribute them.
Okay, okay, you can send to me.
Hmm.
There are a few comments, not questions, about I think supplementary comments for some with some links. Uh, so I can share them with you. So I'm just keeping them.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, another comment is every year there's a festival in his name in Quartzsite, Arizona. Hi,
Oh,
Jolly
nice.
Tom.
Hmm.
Um, so okay, so one question is a little bit long. I live in Vancouver, Canada. Here I see that Muslims with a history of over 50 years in this area have preferred to practice Islam mostly among themselves rather than introducing it to others. They didn't
Hmm.
seem concerned about inviting the native people to Islam. Instead, they focused on practicing Islam with their community and tried to stay connected to their faith.
Hmm.
Additionally, explaining Islam to non-Muslims has not been their top priority. It seems like they placed it as a lower priority, maybe around the fifth level. In your opinion, what is the most effective way to explain and uphold the values of Islam?
Hmm. I think, it's a general concern that we should all have that one, we want to make sure that we preserve the religion within our immediate family and in our communities, our local communities. So I can understand why that would be prioritized. At the same time, I think some of us, maybe not everybody, needs to be able to connect with our neighbors or our colleagues and to create opportunities to explain to them Islam, not necessarily in the form of a lecture, but to just have gatherings and I know that many of our communities do this. They bring people to experience different cultural traditions, the food or musical programs or poetry or something like this because it is enriching to the human experience. Some people travel and go around the world and learn about different cultures, but we can also bring that knowledge. Of course, Islam is part of that. Sometimes it can be in the front because we need to clarify some things, but at the same time, it can be embedded into other kinds of experiences. So I think those would be some ways I think are effective or can be effective um, to explain Islam and our different Muslim cultures and to show our values. Hospitality is one big value. People are often taken aback by how much hospitality Muslim cultures have. Because in Western culture, it just happens to be that everything has become so individualized and sometimes materialized. So it's hard sometimes for people to think, why are you giving me this plate of food? Like for us, it might be a simple thing, like, what do you want from me? You know, so I think those just indicate that there's opportunity for making connections. And once that path is opened, then other information can flow much easier, I think.
Mhm. So it's basically dialogue first, making dialogue first. So another question is, what did 9/11 change in terms of Islam's popularity? How was Islam known as before 9/11?
Well, I mean, it was definitely a traumatic experience for a typical American. So, no doubt it increased a lot of animosity towards Muslims and Islam in general, as a concept would be perceived as a violent religion. And you can see a lot of times these cynical remarks. Oh, yeah, the religion of peace once again has struck again. Like if some other incident takes place somewhere in the world, they say, "Oh, the religion of peace is at it again." It's a very cynical depiction because it doesn't obviously reflect what Islam's teachings are. When people violate the Sharia, they violate the Sharia. They're not enacting the Sharia. So it creates the situation of defensiveness, and we have to educate and we have to clarify. And then some people don't want to be educated, right? They want to maintain their narrative because it benefits their interests, their causes. But I think we also learned in that post 9/11 period, despite all those struggles and the hostility and people being attacked, women being attacked for wearing hijab, or many different incidents that have taken place. At the same time, many people, okay, they had to discover Islam. Like, let me read what this Quran is. Let me read this other book, and maybe I'll take a class, or maybe, it's a longer term process. But, and then the younger people who came, who are kids or who were not even born in 9/11, they only know of it like we know about Pearl Harbor. Like, it happened sometime. And the Japanese were our enemies at that time. But today, no one would think that Japan is our enemy. We want to go to Japan. We want to eat sushi, right? So in that longer time frame, our challenges in the Middle East, there's still so many things happening that are complicating the picture.
Mhm. So was everything fine before 9/11? So I mean,
No. I mean, before, what we had was a more innocent, or let's say like stereotypical understanding of Islam, like, oh, Arab, and Allah is their God, and Muhammad was a prophet, but that has nothing to do with us. Now, we know that Islam is a universal faith tradition that accommodates all people. You don't even have to be Muslim, but you can live within a framework that Muslims can create an environment of safety and dignity and respect for all people.
mhm.
That's Islam, right?
Mhm. Yeah. Another question is how many Muslims in US?
So the question about the number of Muslims, the official studies that have been done in the last few years, like Pew or some other agencies that do polling, I mean, they're going to underreport the full numbers. But those numbers are like the ones that get cited by journalists or by academics, something like between 3 and 4 million Muslims, let's say 4 million Muslims. But Muslim American organizations have often, even 20 years ago, would say, we have 6 million Muslims at that time. Now they might say we have 7 or 8 million Muslims. I mean, it's hard to know for sure, but it's definitely, I would say, above 5 million and maybe up to 7 million. In
Mhm.
California, maybe there will be about 1 million of those 7 million.
Mhm. And what is your future projection of Islam in the USA? This could be a little bit maybe lengthy discussion. But another specific one is, can Muslims play a role in the USA to help counter political polarization? If yes, how?
Well, I mean, Muslims are only 1 to 2% of the US population right now. And maybe it will be decades for that percentage to increase more significantly. It's hard to say, unless there's a mass conversion that takes place to Islam, which, Allahu Alam, it could happen. But if we just go by the normal trends, it will take many decades for Muslims to even become, in France and other countries where Muslims are a significant population. So what that means is that we could translate that to influence, to economic power, and really just the power to create better, proper understanding about the majority of Muslims who are peace-loving and contributing people. And that can influence the culture, that can influence the perception of Islam. Even if people don't themselves become Muslim, their friendships, their working relationships with others who are Muslim and American will neutralize some of the ideological hostility towards Muslims. And, we can also see right now in the case of Palestine in the last 1 year, so many people who are not Arab, not Palestinian, not Muslim, have understood that what is going on is not acceptable. And there has to be support for the cause of the Palestinians and human rights and justice. So I think people can be swayed, let's say, or educated to think about things in the right way, not to change their own identity or something. I mean, if that happens, that's a different matter. But just in terms of having the right mindset about what is important in our collective life. Like we don't want the prison industrial complex. We don't want that. I don't think,
Mm.
I mean, if you're whether you're Christian or Jewish or Muslim or atheist, you don't want young kids locked up in jail forever, and especially on fake charges, or we don't want police brutality. We don't want healthcare that is exorbitant. There are things that we collectively as a humanity can find common ground on. I think Muslims can be part of those conversations and are becoming more and more integrated into those conversations. You cannot have a serious national conversation in the United States without the presence of Muslims. Then we have to decide how wisely can we participate.
Mhm. Next question is, how is the US Muslims connected to the Muslim world, in entire world, I think, and how can that be improved?
It's a good question. I mean, I think Muslim Americans are not always in agreement about certain things, like even the situation in Syria right now. I see a lot of different viewpoints and speculations about who is the beneficiary and who is doing it and who is, it's all over the board. And so sometimes, like Sherman Jackson, who's a famous American Muslim professor at USC, he says that while we want to have good relationships with our brothers and sisters around the world, when it comes to these political issues in those other countries, we really can't get too involved. And we have to find a way to navigate our own situation in the United States, which is difficult as it is, as we've been talking about. But, on a general level of being connected to the Ummah, I think it's important to travel to different parts of the world to connect with our brothers and sisters and to appreciate our diversity and not feel like our ethnic identity is too supreme, right? Our Islamic identity has to be the most important. So I think if we can emphasize that in our relationships with the broader world, that will be helpful. And I think American Muslims are best positioned for that because we are not one ethnicity. If you go to Morocco, you're going to see majority Moroccans, and that's fine over there. Or to Turkey or to India or Pakistan, you're going to see. So it's harder for them. Yes, they can accommodate and be welcoming to people, but their fundamental framework will not be one of diversity. Our fundamental framework has to be that.
Mhm. Mhm. I think you partially answered the next question. How can we, as American Muslims, contribute to the US as well as the whole world in terms of peace, wealth, and politics?
Yeah, I
So,
identify, I spoke to that in the sense that we must be educated ourselves. We must collaborate with one another. We need to create spaces where we can exchange opinions without um, canceling one another or being so dogmatic. Like we have to listen, reflect, and hopefully find a solution that is acceptable if there are different parties involved. But the process of like a civil conversation and decision making needs to be strengthened, I would say. And if we
mm,
can do that, then we can speak to our school board representatives. We can speak to our local police department. We can decide who should go to Congress, not just somebody who says I'm Muslim and give me some money so I can run, but I really, support these policies that are not good, but I'm Muslim, so support me. No, we
mm,
have to, have a way to evaluate the situation and then make sure that what is best for the Ummah and for Americans in general is what we try to support.
mhm. So let's have three more questions. So and time is 7:15. One is again related to 9/11. Is there any statistic that shows the annual revert percentage to Islam in the US before and after 9/11? Have you seen any study for that?
There probably are some. I don't know how rigorous those studies would be. I can't say I have seen it specifically, but I know generally the phenomenon that, people did look into Islam. Even now, because of what's going on in Palestine, there are people who are, quote, looking into Islam. They didn't mean to do it. They find themselves exposed to information that turns the light bulb on, and then they have to go on the journey of, okay, I guess I'm going to become Muslim because it makes sense. And the injustice that I see, there's only one way for me to function is, to join this faith community and to find some comfort and also my clarity theologically and my understanding that we rely on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and we work for change, but there's going to be an accountability.
Mhm. Okay, let me mute. Okay. Another question is, based on my personal experience with African American Muslims, I have gained the impression that even if they have shifted towards Sunni Islam, they still feel a sense of gratitude towards the Nation of Islam for reconnecting them with their roots.
Mhm.
However, the Nation of Islam had a false prophet. Is this impression of mine a general trend? If this matter of reconnecting with roots is true, do African Americans in general also share this sense of gratitude?
Mhm. I think that's an excellent question, and I think it's accurate to say that many Muslims who are African American will not criticize the Nation of Islam. They will say that the theological uh, presentation was wrong. I think they would say that, because um, W. Fard Muhammad was not God and Elijah was not a prophet. They will have no problem saying that, but they will not discard the Nation of Islam as a sociological phenomenon that enabled people with a slave identity to become dignified. It was like a bridge. We may not, like those of us who did not have that experience, we would say it's so clear. One is wrong and one is right. And how can you even give any credence to the wrong part? Different people will have different viewpoints, but it can be understood that African Americans are not simply going to, in how the community was able to journey by God's will to mainstream Islam. So we will find that phenomenon.
Mhm. So we have 3 minutes, and if possible, let's make there were more questions. Let's make 1 minute for each question. Was Quran really used to establish the U.S. Constitution? If so, what laws are based on Quran? What's the motivation behind this?
I don't think I've ever read that the Quran itself directly played a role in like the structure or the formation of the Constitution, but what I have read is that Islamic law, Sharia, was influential in English common law, even though it's not acknowledged, but some of the principles of how to pursue justice made its way into Western legal systems that we call common law. Common law became part of American law as well. So that is kind of part of a framework. And then probably other things in Islamic intellectual history, not again, not Quran per se, but like Islamic thinkers philosophically in their political theory, you know, um, those ideas percolated into Western literature and influenced Enlightenment thinkers. I think that's a fair thing to say. It would be difficult to find exactly the DNA, but I think there are different articles that point to whether it's Ibn Rushd or whether it's Al-Ghazali or whether it's some other figures, even, some Ottoman figures. No doubt European thinkers were exposed to that material. And no doubt it had to shape their own writings. And no doubt those writings ended up in being read by the Americans. Say that. But it's not like a direct line.
So last two questions, I think they're simple to answer. Probably maybe yes or no. One number question. What ratio of Muslim immigrants changed their religion in 19th century? Is there any statistics for this?
Oh, so like if they didn't retain their Islamic faith?
Yeah.
I mean, unfortunately, probably a significant number, especially, in the 19th century. I mean, today, I think we're better positioned. And even now, with all of the institutions that we have and all of the schools that we have and all the masajid, still many people they may not leave Islam like in that sense of I'm going to become an atheist or I'm going to convert to Judaism or Hinduism or Christianity. I mean, few people might do that. Majority will be like, I'm Muslim. I mean, I believe in the tenets of Islam, the Shahada, but I'm not that practicing. And I don't go to the masjid and I don't really adhere to all of the rules. You will find that a lot. But, we hope that everyone who's going through their journey, their spiritual journey, they come to a point in their life where they reassess. Many people may not, and that they will be accountable for. But sometimes people will say, I had this phase in my life and my roots are Islamic or I'm Muslim, so let me return to my faith. But our challenge is also just to make sure our kids have enough of a strong connection that they won't veer away. Or if they do, they won't go too far. Or if they go far, they will come back. That's the challenge. But yes, I mean, unfortunately, as much as many people convert to Islam out of interest, following the practices of Islam is a obligation that some people don't sustain, and so they stop practicing. I don't want to say they stop being Muslim in that sense. So they probably intellectually still believe that Islam is the religion, is the true religion, but they won't live up to the requirements sometimes.
And the last question, are there any Muslim communities similar to the Amish communities which are exclusively living in their own town?
I think there are some. There are some few ones. Some of them in upstate New York or in Texas, or there's just a few examples of that, but not a significant number. Sometimes it's the idea that they can preserve their identity and their faith, but I think most Muslims are not positioned for that kind of arrangement. I mean, they have, especially if you think about how many converts there are, their families are mixed families. So they have relationships with their non-Muslim family members, and they have to kind of stay engaged in that way. And so living in an isolated community may not make sense unless they're accustomed to that lifestyle. But I think most Muslims have, if they have some kind of professional background, then they will be not as likely to do that.
Thank you very much for everything. I think we will have some messages for thank to you. Yeah, Jazakallah khair.
Yeah, it was
So
a pleasure.
let's finish with Asr, Surah Asr. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر صدق الله العظيم الفاتحة. Yeah, thank you very much again, and thanks for everybody for
Shukr.
attendance. Killing me.
Thank you.